Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. This week's episode is geared toward parents and parenting philosophy. So if you are winning in the parenting game and your kids have no issues with motivation or schoolwork or juggling competing interests or handling the stress that often accompanies the competitive college admissions process, then feel free to skip this episode. On the other hand, if any of these challenges or others seem to be cropping up, then maybe you want to stick around. Now, I am not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do have the benefit of working with hundreds of families over the last 8 or 9 years, some very closely, and I do have the experience with 4 of my own kids that I've had the pleasure and the pain of parenting over the last 20 years. And so I wanted to share an insight about parenting that I hope might help. Now, right off the bat, I'm sorry to say that from what I've seen and heard and studied and experienced, there is no silver bullet. There's no magical thing we can say or do that's going to solve all of our teenagers' issues. Teenagers can be complicated. They are all unique. They all see the world through their own eyes and their own way. And they all have different sets of experiences. And for these reasons, how we manage each child will often be calibrated to their particular temperament, to their aspirations, to their mindset. That's not to say that these things are set in stone or even knowable, but we have to start from somewhere. And of course, it's important to remember that our kids are typically works in progress. And they may change their tune over time. And we need to be able to be ready for that and to bob and weave accordingly. What I'd like to discuss today is how we think about discipline versus lack of discipline with our kids. What do I mean by that? Well, there are 2 schools of thought out there. On the one end of the spectrum is the strict disciplinarian parent who's always laying down the law, always drawing boundaries and trying to control things. And pushback from the child is expected, and it's the cost of doing business as a parent. On the other end is the overly permissive parent who takes a hands-off approach. They don't want their child to feel stressed out. They let their child do pretty much whatever they want to do, as long as they're doing what makes them happy. Their child's happiness, quote unquote, is the main goal. And I think we can all agree that taken to extremes, both of these positions may end up with bad outcomes. So I'm not necessarily espousing either of these 2 approaches, especially in the extreme. However, I would like you to consider where you stand on the spectrum of discipline. Do you consider yourself more of a disciplinarian or more of a permissive parent? On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you be? And where would your spouse be? I know some parents out there adopt the good cop, bad cop routine, and sometimes that's effective. But I would like you to think about that and put a number in your head as a frame of reference. Now, as I said at the top, each child is different. There is no one perfect strategy. What works for one child may not work for another, even at the extremes. I have identical twins. Even with identical twins, the same strategy doesn't always work. But what's interesting to me is that I've observed a gradual shift from the disciplinarian to the more permissive parenting style. And just to be clear, this is not a scientific study. It's strictly anecdotal. It's based on hundreds of conversations that I've had with parents. I don't have a longitudinal, double-blind study to cite. This is just my gut sense of the direction parenting seems to have been going for the last 10 years. I don't want to hazard a guess as to why this might be happening, at least not in this episode. And I'm sure you can come up with your own conclusions as to why or if this might be happening, either personally or with others or culturally. I've talked to many parents who start off our conversation about their children and their path to college by saying that they don't want to pressure them too much or influence them too much, that they encourage their kids to do whatever they want as long as they're happy. And I get it. I understand the sentiment here. This is especially the case with highly accomplished parents who've been very successful in various aspects of their lives. They're afraid of projecting too much of themselves onto their children or adding undue pressure to a process that is already fraught with unspoken assumptions and lofty expectations. And that's a reasonable fear to have. However, I also want to caution parents who take this strategy too far, who basically allow their children to do anything as long as it makes them happy. Because I'm not sure that the quote-unquote happiness of a 15 or a 16-year-old is the right outcome to solve for in this equation. Does that mean that I want my kids to be miserable? No. But most experts in the field agree that teenagers need boundaries. Most teenagers want your advice. They want to feel the pressure of your wisdom pushing back on their harebrained schemes, pushing back on their wild and reckless ideas. Of course, you and I both know that they'll never admit this to you. It's not something that they would ever articulate. They wouldn't even know how to express this feeling. They don't even realize it themselves. But they understand it in their bones and they crave it. My point is that, in my opinion, we should not shy away from putting guardrails on our children's choices. It shouldn't be a complete free-for-all. Whether that means a curfew, or the type of car that they can buy, or what concerts they can attend, or what they can download on their phones, or which friends they hang around with. These limitations are helping them more than they are harming them. It doesn't feel great as a parent when we have to establish boundaries, but parenting isn't always about feeling great at all times. In fact, in most cases, it's the opposite. And I know our kids might pitch a fit and read us the riot act and break out their long list of grievances and counterpunches. But in most cases, establishing and sticking to rules is not harming them. You are giving them the benefit of your wisdom. And if we're not using the wisdom that we've acquired over the last 40 or 50 years to help our children, then what was the point of learning all those lessons? And for that matter, what's the point of parenting? Isn't our job as parents to pass along the hard-fought lessons that we've learned along the way? And by the way, if we don't attempt to share our own wisdom, and by wisdom I really mean our values, with our children, there are plenty of other actors out there who will be glad to take on that role. Like Kim Kardashian and Bad Bunny and LeBron and Megan Thee Stallion and Lizzo, and the list goes on and on. Our kids' mobile phones have an unlimited supply of these types of actors. So when I talk to parents whose main goal is that their child is happy, I try to push back a little bit and reframe the thinking. I suggest that they should be less concerned about whether their child is happy and more focused on whether or not their child is well challenged. I want my child to be well challenged versus happy at all times, because being happy 24/7, 365 is not consonant with real life. I think this is an important distinction, because there are a lot of things that might make my sons and other teenage boys, for example, happy. Watching surfing documentaries on loop, playing Grand Theft Auto for 20 straight hours, having Philadelphia cheesesteaks for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the list goes on. But is that what we really want them doing? Is that really what they want to be doing? Probably not. Instead, the trick is to find activities that keep teens well challenged, not so difficult that they give up on day one, but not so easy that they get bored after a week. Video games have this down to a science. The addiction to video games happens because the gameplay constantly makes you think that you're gradually improving, you're getting better and learning the game, but that you still have a long way to go. The key is to make the game just challenging enough that the player feels like they're overcoming something difficult, but not so difficult that they give up. This is the dynamic that drives the human species. Parents, grandparents, children alike. Ask any recent retiree who has an empty calendar for the next 20 years. Ask them how they feel. No challenge, no purpose, no meaning, no life. Teenagers don't know that they were built to be challenged, but it's true. It's a matter of finding the right combination of activities to thread this needle. With this in mind, we should think about how and when we introduce our kids to different activities. Do we throw them into a total immersion Chinese language class 6 days a week on the first day of summer? Probably not. That would probably be too much. We also don't want to put them into a summer sports camp where they are so great that they're destroying everyone in their path. That would get boring and unsatisfying pretty quickly. You can see this dynamic in sports all the time. When a younger athlete who shows a lot of promise gets invited to, quote, play up with the older kids. As parents, we are very flattered by this notion, which often leads to an eagerness to push our kid up to the next level without really thinking about the potential consequences. What if the competition with the older kids is too much and the child performs poorly and then gets turned off to the sport? It happens all the time. My point is to just think about this before making a knee-jerk decision. The question we should be posing to ourselves all the time is not, is my child happy? But rather, is my child being well challenged with their array of academics and sports and volunteer work? If you strike the right balance of challenge, which of course varies from child to child, then the happiness is likely to follow. Solve for the appropriate level of challenge, not 24/7 happiness. And for those who associate discipline with being mean to your children, I contend that it's quite the opposite. Imposing the appropriate level of discipline on your child, maybe in the form of house rules or chores or curfews, is not a sign that you don't like them. It actually demonstrates how much you love them. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that discipline is the highest form of love you can give your child, particularly in the teenage years. Whether that comes in the form of a curfew or in the form of supporting them on very challenging projects that may not deliver happiness all the time. If any of you have ever heard of Jocko Willink, he's a former Navy SEAL officer who has a big social media presence. One of his famous sayings is, discipline equals freedom. By leading a disciplined life, you get all of your tasks done on time and in good order, and that ultimately allows you to enjoy the freedom that you have when you're done with work. I'd like to tweak that phrase a little bit and make it my own. My saying, and then one I want to leave you with today, is discipline equals love. Think about your approach to parenting. Think about how discipline plays a role, or doesn't, with your kids. And think about how to help your child live a well-challenged life. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the continued support. If you know a parent with a 6th, 7th, 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, 11th grader, senior in high school, please share this episode with them. You can do that by finding that small box with the tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button, text it to your friends with a little personal note from you recommending that they give it a listen. Of course, if you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, check out our blog, Facebook page, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.